In order to make an informed decision as to public sector collective bargaining, one needs to understand the philosophy behind collective bargaining. Hi, I'm Rob Klein. I'm a labor lawyer. In the 1930s, President Roosevelt pushed through the Wagner Act, which gave private sector employees, which are those employees that don't work for the government, the right to unionize and to bargain for their wages, benefits, and working conditions. The philosophy behind private sector bargaining was that it is necessary to equalize the power between workers and employers. Back then, the country was heavily industrialized. Many people worked on assembly lines. The law was passed at a time before we had civil rights laws, safety statutes, and many of the other protections that we now take for granted. Consequently, an employee could be fired because he was black, Jewish, or older. You could be fired because you were a woman, and if you were injured on the job, you could be fired. Collective bargaining rights were granted to workers to help end these and other wrongs by balancing the power between workers and their employers. In order to make sure that one side did not dominate the other, and thus preserve a balance of power, the system was set up to be adversarial in nature. Thus, the union was required to advocate on behalf of the employees, and the owner to advocate on behalf of the employer. In fact, it is illegal for an employer to dominate a union, for this would negate the balance of power collective bargaining seeks to ensure. President Roosevelt was just as adamantly opposed to public sector bargaining as he was in favor of private sector bargaining. Roosevelt understood there could not be a balance of power between workers and their employers in the public sector. This is because, unlike owners of businesses who solely represent the interests of the employer, politicians represent everyone. Thus, politicians have an inherent conflict of interest. As there is no adversarial relationship between government workers and the politicians who are supposed to represent the public, there can never be a balance of power between the parties. Further, unions could easily co-opt politicians by promising the politician money in the form of political contributions, television, radio, and internet advertising in favor of the politician or against his or her opponent, workers to attend political rallies, to man phone banks, and to get out the vote, as well as political and monetary backing of the politician's pet causes. The union would provide this monetary and manpower support in return for the politician agreeing to the wages, benefits, and working conditions that the union desired, as the union would be representing the public sector worker, and the politician would be supporting the wages, benefits, and working conditions sought by the union. There would be no one to represent the public's interest. As there would be no one to represent the public's interest, Roosevelt understood that collective bargaining was inherently inappropriate in the public sector. Thus, for decades, there was no such thing as public sector bargaining. It is now clear that Roosevelt's fears were well-founded. In practice, public sector unions have negotiated wages that are higher than the private sector employees who pay them, health insurance benefits and co-pays that are dramatically better than in the private sector, and massive pensions that are bankrupting the states. And of course, teachers' unions have negotiated contracts which make it nearly impossible to terminate even the worst teacher. As the adversarial relationship is missing in the public sector due to politicians often supporting the workers' interests, instead of solely representing the public employer's interests, it is clear that in the public sector, there can never be equality of power between public sector workers and their public employers. As there is no one to represent the public's interest, public sector bargaining is inherently inappropriate and must be eliminated. Thank you.